It started with a thin, crumpled envelope wedged awkwardly into the rusting metal slot of my mailbox. The paper was cheap, the kind that curls under humidity, and the HOA bold block. Letter logo sat at the top like a seal of judgment. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. I had seen enough of these in the neighborhood Facebook group threatening, performative notices sent by an HOA board that seemed to spend more time measuring grass height than maintaining the community playground. The shed had stood in my backyard for 3 years without a single complaint. It wasn't fancy, just a weathered wooden structure I'd picked up secondhand, painted a dull slate gray to match my fence. It was where I kept my tools, some gardening supplies, and an old bicycle I swore I'd fix someday. The structure was solid, quiet, and most importantly, out of sight from the street. At least I thought so. The letter was a 30-day compliance notice. It claimed the shed violated community aesthetic cohesion and was non-conforming to HOA design standards. There was no citation of a specific rule, just vague language about overall harmony of visual presentation. The deadline was exact, 30 days from the postmark date, or I would face escalating fines and further action, which in HOA speak was code for legal trouble. At first, I thought it was a mistake. My neighbors had backyard sheds, some in far worse condition. One had peeling paint and a sagging roof. Another looked like it had been hit by a small tornado. But those belonged to board members' friends. The HOA had a long history of selective enforcement, and I had a feeling this wasn't about the shed at all. It was about me. The trouble started months earlier when I opposed a special assessment the board tried to push through. They wanted every homeowner to chip in for clubhouse renovations that conveniently included an office for the HOA president. I had shown up at the meeting, armed with budget printouts and pointed questions, and managed to sway enough votes to stop it. Since then, I'd noticed the subtle changes, the random lawn inspections, the overly detailed letters about trash bins, the sudden enforcement of rules no one remembered voting on. This shed notice was their latest move. The smart play would have been to quietly take the shed down and avoid the fight. But there was something in that letter, the smug tone, the empty threats, that made me decide otherwise. They wanted me to tear down my shed. I would not only keep it, I would make it impossible for them to touch it again. I spent the next week researching HOA bylaws, city zoning ordinances, state statutes on property rights. I learned something interesting. While HOA can regulate the appearance of structures, they cannot override municipal permits for legally compliant buildings. The shed I had was never formally approved, which gave them leverage. But if I got the city to approve a new structure, something that met or exceeded all building codes, the HOA ability to challenge it would evaporate. The idea came to me one night as I was staring at the notice under the harsh glow of my kitchen light. If they hated my shed, they were really going to hate what I had in mind, a fully permitted 3-story art studio that would stand tall enough to cast a shadow over their precious clubhouse. It would be perfectly legal, designed to every letter of the municipal code, and once built, it would be untouchable. Before I could do that, I needed to buy time. I responded to the notice with a carefully worded letter asking for clarification on the exact rules my shed allegedly violated. I requested copies of meeting minutes, architectural guidelines, and any inspection reports related to my property. HOA boards love to threaten, but they hate paperwork. especially when they know their enforcement is inconsistent. My letter bought me weeks of backhand, fourth exchanges, each one dragging the clock closer to the 30-day deadline. Meanwhile, I started meeting with an architect. The plan was ambitious. A tall, narrow building that would fit neatly into my backyard footprint while meeting every setback requirement. The bottom floor would be storage, the second floor a workspace, and the top floor a glass, walled loft that would double as my reading nook. The city would see it as an art studio. The HOA would see it as a middle finger they couldn't touch. Every interaction with the HOA over those weeks was a chess move. They tried sending friendly reminders about the shed deadline. I responded with formal requests for extensions pending resolution of documentation disputes. They threatened fines. I cited state law requiring due process and uniform enforcement. By the time my permit application was filed with the city, we were already 45 days past their original deadline. I kept my backyard quiet during this time. The shed stood exactly as it was, no repairs, no upgrades, no reason for them to accuse me of altering it without permission. My real work was happening in the background, and the more they pushed, the more they played into my hands. Then one morning I received an envelope from the city's planning department. Inside was my approved building permit. The words were like music. Permit granted for construction of accessory building 3-story studio. All I had to do now was break ground, and the HOA nightmare would truly begin. The notice that started it all was still pinned to my refrigerator with a magnet. I didn't take it down. It was a reminder that sometimes the best revenge is patience, precision, and a little bit of paperwork. The day the first construction crew arrived with their trucks and equipment, the HOA board members watched from across the street, confusion etched on their faces. They thought I was dismantling the shed. They had no idea what was about to rise in its place, and that's where the real trouble began. The sound of the first shovel hitting dirt carried across the quiet cul-de-sac like a starting pistol. Neighbors emerged onto their porches, coffee mugs in hand, pretending to water plants or check mailboxes, but really watching the sudden flurry of activity in my backyard. By mid-morning, a small construction crew had cordoned off my driveway, unloading lumber, scaffolding, and steel supports onto the grass. The HOA president, Mrs. Whitmore, appeared on the sidewalk with a clipboard, flanked by 2 other board members like she was about to conduct a military inspection. They were expecting demolition. 30 days had long since passed, and in their minds the non-conforming shed was about to be hauled away in pieces. What they didn't expect was the arrival of a licensed contractor, city, approved blueprints, and the bright yellow permit stapled proudly to the temporary fence. When Mrs. Whitmore asked what was happening, the contractor pointed silently at the permit, as if it were a holy relic. That permit was my shield. It spelled out in black ink exactly what was being built. A 3-story accessory structure, fully compliant with municipal codes. The wording was precise: no shed, no temporary structure, just studio. It was a term deliberately chosen to slide past HOA aesthetic arguments. The city didn't care if the building clashed with the HOA visual harmony, as long as it was safe, legal, and taxed. The first day of work was uneventful for the crew, but tense for me. I could feel the HOA circling, waiting for an opening. That evening, an email arrived from their compliance committee, demanding to see HOA approved architectural review documents for the new structure. They had no idea I'd been preparing for this exact move. I replied, attaching a single page from their own bylaws that exempted any city, approved structures from HOA design control, an obscure clause buried deep in the document, likely forgotten by most board members. The real battle was psychological. They were used to homeowners crumbling under pressure, afraid of fines or lawsuits. My calm responses, always rooted in their own rules, seemed to unnerve them. The more I leaned on the letter of the law, the more cautious they became, worried they might overstep and open themselves up to legal action. By the second week of construction, the foundation was poured, and the frame of the first story began to take shape. It was taller than the original shed by several feet, and the sightline from the street was undeniable. The HOA clubhouse, previously the tallest non-residential structure in the neighborhood, now had a growing rival. Mrs. Whitmore made a point of accidentally walking by every afternoon, her lips pursed tighter each time. The neighborhood began to buzz with speculation. Some neighbors loved what I was doing, seeing it as a long, overdue pushback against the board's overreach. Others were nervous, worried that standing near me on trash day might put them on the HOA radar. The Facebook group lit up with vague posts about certain people who think the rules don't apply to them. And while no names were mentioned, the comments section made it clear who they were talking about. One evening, as the crew wrapped up for the day, I overheard two board members whispering near my driveway. They were discussing whether the HOA could declare my project a nuisance based on its impact on community character. I smiled to myself. Impact on community character was not a legal term. It was a subjective gripe dressed up as regulation. In court, it would be laughed out of existence. Still, I made a note to keep every interaction documented. Every letter, every photo, every half-baked threat would go into a file I was building for the inevitable showdown. By the time the frame for the second story went up, the structure had become impossible to ignore. From my upstairs bedroom window, I could now see over the clubhouse roofline. The HOA pride and joy, once the dominant landmark of the community, was beginning to look small. And this was before the third story, the crown jewel, even began. The tipping point came halfway through the second month of construction. The HOA sent me a notice of violation, claiming my contractors were starting work too early in the morning, disturbing the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood. I responded with a copy of the city's noise ordinance, which clearly allowed construction from 7:00 a.m. onward. My crew started work at 7:05 every day, no earlier. I even printed out the ordinance and taped it to my front door for their convenience. The small victories piled up, each one chipping away at their confidence. They wanted me to feel cornered, but it was them who were starting to look desperate. I could see it in Mrs. Whitmore's face whenever she walked by, how her polite good mornings had given way to thinly veiled glares. And then, one afternoon, the first real sign of panic appeared. A notice was taped to my door while I was out, this one not from the HOA, but from a private law firm. It was a cease and desist letter, demanding that I halt construction until architectural disputes were resolved. The problem for them was simple. The city's permit trumped their complaints. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, and within 48 hours, it was formally dismissed as unenforceable. When the scaffolding went up for the third story, I knew the real war was about to begin. The HOA had been trying to win through intimidation, but now that they saw the final form taking shape, 3 full stories, the top wrapped in sleek glass, they were running out of moves. And they hated losing. They still had 1 card left to play. Unfortunately for them, I had been expecting it all along. The 3rd story changed everything. Up until that point, the HOA could still pretend the construction was a minor issue, just a replacement shed that had gotten slightly out of hand. But when the 3rd floor framing went up, with steel beams stretching above the roof lines of half the block, the reality hit them like a brick. This was not going away. The top floor was designed to be a glass, walled loft with panoramic views. From there, I would have an unobstructed sightline straight into the HOA clubhouse windows. It wasn't intentional, at least not on paper. But I knew it would get under their skin, and it did. Mrs. Whitmore's afternoon walks past my driveway had stopped altogether. Now she stood on the clubhouse patio with binoculars, pretending to be checking roof conditions, while really trying to assess just how much of their little empire I could see from my perch. 2 weeks into the 3rd floor build, I got the letter I'd been waiting for. It came via certified mail, in a thick white envelope with a law firm's letterhead embossed in gold. This was their big move, a formal petition for temporary restraining order, filed in county court. They wanted an emergency order to stop my construction until a judge could review the architectural dispute. The problem with this strategy was that restraining orders in property disputes require proof of irreparable harm. And it looks ugly, or it hurts our feelings, doesn't qualify. My attorney and I had anticipated this, and the moment the petition landed, we filed a motion to dismiss, attaching a stack of documents: the city permit, compliance photos, HOA bylaws with the municipal exemption highlighted, and a copy of the obscure state statute that explicitly limited HOA authority over permitted structures. Court dates move slowly, but emergency hearings do not. Within days, we stood in front of a judge who looked over the paperwork for all of 5 minutes before saying, "If the city has approved this, I'm not stopping it." Just like that, their last legal bullet misfired. What they didn't realize was that their failed attempt had just opened a door for me. In my countersuit for legal fees, I included a request for a declaratory judgment, something that would formally and permanently recognize my right to keep the structure. If granted, it would not only make my studio untouchable, it would also set a precedent preventing the HOA from trying the same stunt with anyone else. I wasn't just defending my project anymore. I was building a shield for every homeowner on the block. Back in the neighborhood, the failed court attempt sent shockwaves. People started approaching me in hushed tones at the mailbox or while walking their dogs, sharing their own run-ins with the HOA. One man admitted they'd threatened to fine him for having unapproved flowers in his front yard. Another said they tried to ban his work truck from parking in his own driveway. Everyone had a story, but most had been too afraid to fight back. My project was changing that. The HOA board went into damage control mode. The Facebook group, once a place for passive-aggressive posts, became an outright propaganda channel. They claimed I was destabilizing property values, endangering neighborhood safety, and even attracting unwanted attention to the community. None of it stuck. If anything, more neighbors started openly questioning why the board was so obsessed with my yard instead of fixing the broken pool gate. Meanwhile, the studio took shape at a pace that must have felt like slow torture to them. The siding went up, clean and modern, in sharp contrast to the beige vinyl sameness of the HOA approved houses. The glass panels for the loft were installed, reflecting the sky during the day and glowing softly at night when the interior lights were on. It was beautiful, and I knew they hated every inch of it. Then came the petty sabotage attempts. Twice, construction materials were mysteriously moved overnight. Once the porta potty was tipped over. My contractor installed security cameras, and within a week we caught a figure on video at 2 a.m. wearing a hoodie and latex gloves, trying to tamper with the scaffolding. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but the posture, the walk, it looked suspiciously like a certain HOA board member. I didn't go public with the video right away. I saved it, knowing it might be worth far more later. By the time the final exterior details were complete, the studio towered over the clubhouse like a quiet sentinel. The view from the loft was better than I imagined: rolling rooftops, the distant hills, and yes, the HOA manicured lawns in all their overregulated glory. I could see the pool, the tennis courts, even the parking lot where Mrs. Whitmore held her clipboard inspections. It was a view they could never take away from me. But while the structure itself was untouchable now, the fight wasn't over. The HOA had lost the legal battle, but they hadn't lost their will to harass me. They still had fines, nuisance claims, and a network of rule enforcers willing to get creative. And I was ready for them. The next phase of my plan wasn't about defense anymore. It was about making sure they could never pull this on anyone again. The studio was finished. The court had ruled in my favor, and the HOA could no longer legally touch it. On paper, that should have been the end of the story. But HOA boards like ours don't accept defeat. They just changed tactics, and now their tactics were pettiness turned into an art form. It started small. My mailbox flag mysteriously broke off one night. A week later, my trash bins weren't picked up, even though every other bin on the street was emptied. Then came the random inspections, 3 in a single month, looking for unapproved exterior modifications. They found nothing, but the point wasn't to enforce rules anymore. It was to make my life just uncomfortable enough that I'd start regretting the fight. The most blatant move was the nuisance landscaping violation. I received a formal notice stating that my front yard did not meet community visual standards because there were gaps in the lawn. The gaps they were talking about, 2 small patches of dirt where my sprinklers had been briefly turned off during construction. I reseeded them the same day, but the notice had already been filed in my permanent record. I knew what they were doing, trying to build a paper trail so they could claim I was a repeat offender. It was a long game, but they underestimated my patience. Every violation notice was met with a time-stamped photo proving compliance, sent directly to their email with a copy to my attorney. My file wasn't filling up with violations. It was filling up with proof of their harassment. The neighbors started to notice too. One afternoon, I found a small note tucked under my doormat. It was from a couple who lived 3 houses down. They wrote that they'd seen HOA members parked across from my house late at night, taking notes and watching the property. Another neighbor confided that the board had been asking people to report any unusual activity near my home, as if I were running some kind of underground operation from my studio. The irony was, my studio was just that, an art studio. The bottom floor held tools and storage, the second floor was my workspace, and the loft was my reading and writing spot. There were no loud parties, no commercial traffic, no chaos. The only thing disruptive about it was that it existed against the HOA will. But the more they tried to isolate me, the more support I gained. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before started dropping by to see the studio. Some brought cookies, others just wanted a tour. It became a quiet form of protest, showing up at my property, enjoying my space, and indirectly thumbing their nose at the board. The HOA hated it. I could see them taking photos of people coming and going, as if they were gathering evidence for a case that didn't exist. The breaking point came when they decided to escalate to fines. One morning, I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope labeled Final Notice, Fine Assessment. Inside was a statement claiming I owed the HOA $750 for repeated violations of community standards. The list of violations included everything from improper yard maintenance to unauthorized exterior lighting, referring to the small solar lamps along my walkway, which, according to their own bylaws, didn't require approval at all. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. They'd crossed from petty harassment into financial aggression. And with that move, they'd given me the ammunition I needed for my next step, a formal harassment claim and a push to audit their enforcement history. It was my ace in the hole. If the HOA enforcement was found to be selective or retaliatory, it wouldn't just wipe my fines. It could force a complete policy rewrite and potentially remove board members from their positions. I'd been collecting evidence for months, and now I finally had the trigger to use it. While my attorney began preparing the paperwork, I kept my day calm. The studio was my refuge. I'd sit in the loft at sunset, watching the orange glow spill over the clubhouse, knowing every minute they saw it was another reminder that they had lost control. The pettier they became, the more obvious it was to the rest of the neighborhood that this wasn't about rules. It was about revenge. Then, one evening, a neighbor sent me something that changed the game entirely. A screenshot of a private HOA board group chat. In it, board members were openly discussing ways to make an example out of me. They even joked about how funny it would be if construction accidents delayed my project. This after the scaffolding tampering months earlier. That screenshot was more than just evidence of harassment. It was proof of intent. And with it, the story was about to go far beyond our little neighborhood. The screenshot was gold, not just because it confirmed what I already knew, that the HOA actions were deliberate and retaliatory, but because it came from inside their own ranks. Someone on that board didn't just disagree with their behavior, they wanted me to win. The group chat was a mix of smug one-liners and casually incriminating remarks. Lines like, "Make him wish he never fought us," and "Delay crews if you can, he'll crack eventually." But the one that sealed their fate was a joke about accidents slowing my construction, typed out just weeks after we'd caught someone tampering with the scaffolding on camera. That single message shifted their behavior from petty mismanagement to something that could be argued as targeted intimidation or even criminal intent. I didn't go to the police first. I went to the press. A local news station had been running a series on HOA horror stories, and I knew they were hungry for a case with tangible evidence. I sent them the screenshots, the video footage, and a neatly organized timeline of every violation notice, fine, and late-night surveillance incident I'd endured. They called me back within an hour. By the following week, the story was everywhere. My photo, standing in front of the three-story studio, ran alongside headlines like HOA accused of harassing homeowner after legal victory. The reporter's segment showed clips of the group chat messages, blurred for privacy but clear enough for anyone in the neighborhood to recognize the tone. Neighbors started talking openly, some on camera, sharing their own experiences. The pattern was undeniable. If you crossed the board, you became a target. The fallout was immediate. An emergency HOA meeting was called, open to all residents. It was held in the clubhouse, the same building my studio now overlooked. The tension in that room was thick. Mrs. Whitmore sat at the head of the table, lips pressed in a thin, pale line, flanked by the other board members. When residents demanded explanations, the answers were vague. They blamed taken out of context, jokes and misunderstandings. No one bought it. I didn't even have to say much. The evidence spoke for itself. Every time they denied something, I'd quietly hand my attorney a printed copy of a photo, a time-stamped email, or a recorded voicemail proving the opposite. The crowd noticed. By the end of the meeting, the calls for board resignations had started. The very next day, flyers appeared on doorsteps announcing a petition to recall the current HOA leadership. And for the first time since this mess started, it wasn't me doing the organizing. It was my neighbors. People who'd once kept their heads down were now openly challenging the authority that had made so many of us miserable. The board tried to spin the story as outside interference, damaging our community image. But the damage was already done. The news coverage had triggered interest from the state HOA Oversight Committee, which meant an odd. It was now officially underway. Every fine they'd issued in the past 5 years would be reviewed. Every enforcement record would be checked for consistency. It was the one thing they feared more than losing face, losing their power. Through it all, my studio stood like a silent monument to the whole conflict. When the news crew came to film a follow-up, they insisted on shooting a segment from the loft. The camera panned across the neighborhood, stopping on the HOA clubhouse, which looked small and unremarkable in the background. That visual, my view over their building, was the image that spread online like wildfire. Support from outside the neighborhood started pouring in. People sent emails and letters from other cities, sharing their own HOA battles and thanking me for pushing back. Some even drove by just to see the studio for themselves, snapping photos like it was a roadside attraction. The board was unraveling. One member resigned within a week of the news breaking, citing personal reasons. Another stopped showing up to meetings entirely. Mrs. Whitmore was still clinging to her position, but the recall petition was gaining signatures fast. I knew it was only a matter of time before the vote was inevitable, but they weren't going to go quietly. The remaining board members started dropping hints that they were exploring legal recourse against me for defamation. They wanted me to be afraid of another lawsuit. What they didn't realize was that defamation claims don't survive when the statements are provably true, and I had more than enough proof. The war had gone from quiet backyard drama to a full-scale public scandal, and the board was bleeding credibility by the day. All I had to do now was keep the pressure steady until they imploded entirely, and the moment that finally happened would be even sweeter than finishing the studio. The recall vote was scheduled for a Saturday morning, a choice the board likely made thinking fewer people would show up. They were wrong. By the time I walked to the clubhouse, the parking lot was full, and a line of residents stretched to the sidewalk. Some had clipboards, others had homemade signs, and more than a few wore wide, satisfied smiles. It wasn't just turnout, it was energy, the kind that comes when people know they're about to take back something that was stolen from them. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Mrs. Whitmore sat stiffly at the head of the table, flanked by the two remaining loyalists. Their faces were pale, their posture rigid, but their eyes gave away the truth. They knew the numbers weren't going their way. When the meeting opened, they tried to frame the recall effort as divisive and harmful to property values. But the crowd didn't want speeches. They wanted a vote. It didn't take long. Ballots were passed out, marked, and collected. As they were counted, you could hear the low hum of conversation ripple through the room. Then came the announcement. The recall passed by a landslide. All 3 board members were officially removed, effective immediately. The room erupted in applause, cheers, and even a few relieved laughs. Mrs. Whitmore didn't look at me as she left the clubhouse. She didn't have to. I could feel the weight of her glare even as she walked out the door. Clutching her clipboard like it was a lifeline she no longer had. With the board dissolved, an interim committee of residents was formed to oversee operations until new elections could be held. This group was made up of people who had spent years quietly resenting the old regime, and their first order of business was to freeze all ongoing fines and enforcement actions until after the audit. That meant every bogus violation against me was instantly dead in the water. The state awed, it began in earnest the following week. Investigators requested every enforcement record from the past 5 years, and the patterns were as blatant as I'd suspected. Selective targeting, inconsistent penalties, and multiple fines issued without documented violations. Rumors swirled that the old board might face civil penalties themselves, though whether that would actually happen was still uncertain. For me, the fight was finally over. The harassment stopped. No more late, night cars parked across the street. No more bogus notices in the mailbox. No more feeling like every trip to get the mail was an ambush waiting to happen. The quiet was almost strange at first, like my house had exhaled for the first time in months. But the studio, that was something else entirely. It had gone from a private project to a neighborhood symbol. People still came by to see it, some out of curiosity, others because they saw it as proof that the HOA reign was over. Kids played in the yard again without parents worrying about rules. Neighbors planted flowers, painted shutters, and made small changes that reflected their own tastes instead of the board's rigid standards. One evening, as I sat in the loft with the windows open, I could hear the faint sound of laughter and conversation drifting from porches down the street. It was the sound of a neighborhood shaking off its fear. My studio wasn't just a building anymore. It was the reminder that the HOA didn't get the final say in how we lived our lives. The local news did one more follow-up piece, this time not about the conflict, but about the community's recovery. They filmed me walking through the studio, talking about how it started as a shed the HOA wanted gone, and ended up as a three-story landmark that outlasted the people who tried to stop it. The footage of the sunset over the loft's glass walls made the final cut, with the reporter noting how a fight over one man's backyard sparked a movement that changed a neighborhood. By the time new elections were held, almost every candidate ran on a platform of fairness and transparency. The new board was smaller, humbler, and far less interested in measuring grass height. And though I never planned on it, I was asked to run. I declined not because I didn't care, but because my work here was done. The shed they wanted gone was gone. In its place stood something they couldn't touch, a permanent reminder that they lost, and for me, that was more than enough. The war was over. The recall ended the fight, but the ripple effects were only beginning. News of our HOA collapse spread far beyond the local station. A few weeks after the vote, an online news outlet picked up the story, publishing a headline that practically begged to go viral. HOA tried to demolish his shed and now he's looking down on their clubhouse from a 3-story studio. The article exploded across social media, racking up thousands of shares and comments from people who had their own HOA horror stories. Within days, my inbox filled with messages from strangers, homeowners from other states, people in the middle of their own battles, and even a few lawyers asking for copies of the bylaw loopholes I'd used. Some wrote just to say thank you, telling me they were going to fight back too. Others wanted to visit. One guy from 3 counties over asked if he could bring a drone to film aerial footage of the studio for inspiration. The attention was surreal. My quiet street became something of a pilgrimage site for the anti-HOA crowd. Cars would slow, roll past my house, cameras raised, sometimes with people giving me a thumbs up as they went by. A few even stopped to take selfies in front of the studio. The neighbors didn't mind. Most of them were still enjoying the afterglow of being free from constant surveillance and nitpicking. Meanwhile, the state audit continued to peel back layers of the old board's behavior. The findings, when they finally came, read like a manual for abuse of power. Selective enforcement, missing meeting minutes, fines without documentation, and even misused HOA funds. It turned out the clubhouse renovations they'd tried to push earlier weren't just self-serving, they were going to be funded in part by improper fee increases. The state's recommendation was blunt. The old board members could face personal liability if homeowners decided to sue. And that's when the quiet revenge began. A small group of residents, including some who'd never spoken up before, filed a class action lawsuit against the former board. I didn't join. It wasn't my fight anymore, but I handed over every bit of evidence I'd collected. If the old board thought they could slip away unnoticed, they were about to learn that the neighborhood had a long memory. The funniest part came from the real estate listings. Properties in our community were suddenly marketing themselves as being in a newly reformed HOA with homeowner-friendly policies. The same neighborhood where, less than a year ago, people whispered about the board like they were the secret police, was now selling itself as a place of freedom and creativity. The studio had become part of that image. Real estate agents actually used photos of it in their listings, calling it a symbol of homeowner independence, and proof that architectural diversity thrives here. I never thought a building in my backyard would become a marketing tool, but here we were. Then came the podcast interviews. A few popular shows reached out, wanting me to tell the whole story in my own words. Sitting in the loft, microphone in hand, I recounted every step, from the crumpled violation notice to the court victory. The hosts loved it, and listeners ate it up. I didn't just talk about my fight. I gave tips on how to research bylaws, how to stall enforcement, and how to build public pressure. The episode became one of their most downloaded of the year. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I realized this was bigger than me. My fight had turned into a blueprint for other homeowners who were tired of being pushed around. The studio was no longer just mine. It was a symbol people pointed to when they needed hope in their own battles. And while I enjoyed the peace that followed the HOA fall, part of me knew the story wasn't finished. Because, if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that power doesn't just disappear. It waits, and sometimes it tries to come back. Years passed. Seasons rolled over the street like slow tides, repainting the neighborhood in different shades of calm. The studio, with its tall windows and proud silhouette, stood like a watchtower over it all. It had been repainted once, upgraded with solar panels, and was now surrounded by a thriving garden that spilled into the yard with colors the old HOA would have fined me for. The community had changed in ways that went deeper than appearances. The new scaled back HOA barely resembled the old one. It handled little more than landscaping contracts and neighborhood safety updates. Meetings were short and cordial. The bylaws had been rewritten from the ground up, this time with homeowner rights explicitly protected. People built pergolas, painted their houses in warm, earthy colors, and planted gardens without fear of a violation notice. It was a different place. The studio continued to draw visitors. Art classes were held on the first floor twice a month. The second floor served as a gallery, and the loft had become my private workspace, filled with light in the mornings and the hum of creative energy. Every now and then, someone would climb the stairs, look out at the neighborhood below, and say the same thing. Hard to believe this used to be the most strict HOA in the county. It felt like a closed chapter until the letter arrived. It was subtle, almost polite. A thin white envelope with the new HOA logo addressed to all homeowners. Inside was a notice about proposed adjustments to community standards and an invitation to a special meeting. The language was soft, full of words like uniformity and enhancing property values, but buried halfway down was a phrase that made my pulse quicken: architectural consistency guidelines. I'd seen this playbook before. It was the first step, the gentle reintroduction of control, the kind that creeps in slowly until it's too late to stop. At the meeting, the new president smiled warmly as she talked about protecting the character of our neighborhood, but I noticed the careful wording, the open-ended clauses. It was exactly how the old board had started years ago. This time, though, the room wasn't filled with polite nods. People had been here before, they remembered. When the floor opened for comments, hands shot up. Residents asked pointed questions. They wanted to know exactly what architectural consistency meant, why it was needed now, and what protections were in place to prevent abuse. The president tried to reassure them, but the unease spread, and then someone brought up the studio. They called it a symbol of what the neighborhood had become, a place where individuality wasn't just allowed, but celebrated. They said any new guidelines that could have stopped it from being built would erase everything we'd worked for. Others nodded, some even clapped. The tone shifted. By the end of the night, the proposal was tabled indefinitely. No vote, no policy change. The attempt had been stopped before it even began. Walking home under the streetlights, I realized something. The studio wasn't just a building I'd fought for. It was a guard tower in the truest sense, not because of its height, but because of what it stood for. It was a reminder to anyone who tried to bring the old ways back that this community had learned to fight, and it would again if necessary. Years from now, when my time here is over, the studio will still stand. Maybe it'll belong to someone else. Maybe it'll be used for something new. But the story will remain etched into its walls. A reminder that sometimes the smallest battles, a shed, a notice, a deadline, can spark a fight that changes everything. And if the HOA ever tries again, they'll find the same thing the last board did. Some structures are built to last, and some victories are impossible to tear down.